In the deceptive, evening quiet of a London kitchen in mid-July. The light was fading, filtering through the tall windows of the Berenson home and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, silent spectators. Alicia Berenson sat at the heavy wooden table with a glass of wine, watching her husband move. To her, Gabriel was elegant and balletic as he navigated the small, familiar space. He moved with a focused, effortless grace, his hands steady as he prepared dinner, the clinking of porcelain and the hiss of the stove creating a domestic symphony that Alicia found deeply soothing. Gabriel was a man of light, a celebrated fashion photographer who spent his days capturing the world in stark, beautiful angles. In that moment, Alicia felt a surge of adoration so profound it was almost painful. Gabriel stopped his work and turned to her, handing her a small parcel wrapped in dark, heavy paper. It was a black leather diary. He suggested she use it to capture her thoughts. A way to anchor her often turbulent internal world and prove to him, and perhaps to herself, that she was truly okay. Alicia accepted the gift and eventually began to write. In her first entry, she resolved to keep the diary as a sanctuary of positivity, writing to herself that she would only record happy, normal thoughts, a decision she made not as a promise to Gabriel, but as a quiet commitment to her own stability. But the mid-July serenity was a fragile mask. The warmth soon soured, ripening into a stifling, record-breaking heatwave that draped itself over London like a heavy, sodden blanket. By late August, the air had become thick and unbreathable. A physical weight that pressed the city into a state of agitated exhaustion. The heat seemed to vibrate off the pavement, turning the leafy streets of Hampstead into a pressurized oven. On the night of August 25th, the hottest night of the year, the silence of the Berenson home was shattered with a finality that would echo through the tabloids for years. When the police finally breached the front door, they were met by a scene of forensic horror that felt disconnected from the elegant life previously lived there. The house was dark, the air inside stagnant and smelling of iron and spent gunpowder. In the drawing room, Gabriel Berenson was tied to a chair with wire, the same wire Alicia used for hanging canvases, his body slumped forward in a posture of total defeat. He had been shot 5 times in the face at close range, the violence of the act so extreme it had transformed him into a stranger. Alicia was found standing by the fireplace. A ghost-like figure in a white dress that was now a shocking, vivid crimson. She was motionless, her wrists deeply carved, a knife lying at her feet. When the officers spoke to her, she didn't offer a single word of defense or explanation. Her silence was immediate and absolute, a fortress she retreated into as the world outside began to label her a monster. Her only statement to the world would be the painting she finished in the weeks following the murder, a self-portrait titled Alcestis, a name taken from the Greek tragedy of a woman who dies so her husband might live. Theo Faber watched the case from a distance, but his interest was not the morbid curiosity of the public. He was a forensic psychotherapist who looked at Alicia's silence as a puzzle that mirrored his own fractured history. Theo's own foundation was built on the shifting sands of a traumatic childhood in Surrey. He was a suburban boy who had grown up in a house where the atmosphere was dictated by the unpredictable, violent rages of his father. He remembered the sound of the front door opening and the immediate, sick tightening of his stomach. To survive, he had learned to seek refuge in the garden during the winter months. He remembered the specific, freezing silence of those nights, and the way he would stand in the dark, catching snowflakes on his fingertips. For those few seconds, the world was safe and pure, a memory of absolute honesty that he carried into his adult life. Before his life with Kathy, there had been Marianne, a woman who had provided him with a steady, comfortable existence. The moment Theo met Kathy, he discarded Marianne with a coldness that bordered on the clinical. He ended their shared life in a phone call, brutal, yes, and unkind, as he himself acknowledged, moving on without a backward glance. Now, as his marriage to Kathy began to fray under the weight of her secret life, Theo returned to his old habits of containment. Every night, he sat in the dark of his flat, the sweet, heavy scent of marijuana filling his lungs as he used the smoke to quiet the noise of his own growing paranoia. He moved through his days guided by the internal voice of Ruth, the therapist who had saved him after his own suicide attempt at university. Ruth was the conscience he constantly consulted, the one who questioned why he was so drawn to the silent woman at the Grove. When Theo arrived at the Grove for his interview, he found a unit in a state of slow decay. He met with a panel consisting of Lazarus Diomedes, Indira Sharma, and Stephanie Clark. In a room that felt thick with professional arrogance. He already knew Christian West from their time working together at Broadmoor, and he was aware of West's cold and cutting manner. During his time at the Grove, West dismissed Alicia's claims of being watched by a stalker as nothing more than artistic nerves, a way to pathologize her fear rather than address it. Theo also encountered Rowena Hart, the art therapist, whose frustration with Alicia was a constant presence in the ward. Rowena felt professionally snubbed by Alicia's refusal to engage in art therapy, viewing her silence and distance as a personal affront. Theo realized that to reach Alicia, he would have to navigate the rigid rules and cautious personalities of the unit with care. He observed Yuri, the head nurse, and noted the dynamics of the ward. He began to understand who he would need to work with and around to get the unsupervised time he needed with his patient. He was now ready to enter the goldfish bowl and face the woman who had traded her voice for a secret. The therapy sessions began in a cramped interview room at the Grove, a space where the air felt stale and the silence was heavy enough to touch. The walls were a clinical, uninspiring shade of beige, and the only window was a high, reinforced pane that let in a sliver of the relentless August sun. Theo sat across from Alicia, his notebook open and a pen poised in his hand, but his mind was elsewhere, navigating the complex internal landscape of a man who was both a healer and a hunter. He watched her for hours, observing the way the heavy sedation flattened her features into a mask of indifference. Her hair was lank, and her skin had the gray, waxy sheen of someone who had been denied sunlight for far too long. He knew that this state of chemical submission was a victory for the cautious administration of the Grove, which had kept Alicia heavily medicated for years. Rowena Hart, the art therapist, felt professionally snubbed by Alicia's total refusal to engage in art therapy sessions, viewing her silence and passivity as an insult to her efforts. But when Theo proposed letting Alicia work alone on her own terms, with her own space to create, Rowena's response surprised him. She thought it was a great idea. To get the unsupervised time he needed with Alicia, Theo relied on a simpler, more direct approach. He asked Yuri to step out of the room and took full responsibility for the decision. It was during these sessions that he began to speak to her about the Alcestis myth, probing for a flicker of life behind her eyes. He spoke of the betrayal of a shared life and the cruelty of a husband who would allow his wife to die in his place. He watched her face with forensic intensity, finally rewarded by a microscopic tightening of her jaw that confirmed she was not just present, but listening. While he worked to dismantle Alicia's silence at the Grove, Theo's own domestic reality was dissolving into a series of calculated surveillance logs. The heat of the London summer had turned his flat into a greenhouse of suspicion, where every creak of the floorboards felt like a lie. One evening, Kathy mentioned casually that Nicole, a friend who had recently returned from New York, wanted to meet her on Thursday night after rehearsal. She said it without making eye contact, and Theo felt his suspicion sharpen instantly. Driven by a cold, investigative fury, Theo followed her that Thursday night, discarding his role as a therapist to become a predator stalking his own wife through the sweltering city streets. He watched from the shadows as Kathy entered a restaurant and met Nicole. The meeting was entirely innocent, just as Kathy had said, leaving Theo feeling foolish and paranoid. However, the doubt that had been quietly building in him did not vanish. On a later, separate occasion, he followed her again, moving through the deep shadows of the park near the Heath. This time, his paranoia was vindicated as he watched Kathy meet a man whose movements were confident and familiar. This was the real betrayal, an echoing of the infidelity Kathy had committed against her previous boyfriend, Daniel, when she first met Theo. The cycle was repeating itself, and Theo felt a mounting sense of rage that threatened to shatter his clinical composure. To numb the pain of this discovery, he returned home and retreated into his nightly ritual of marijuana use. He sat in the dark, the sweet, thick smoke containing the anger that he couldn't yet allow to spill over into his professional life, using the drug to create a state of artificial containment. The tension finally reached a breaking point during an unscheduled session at the Grove. Theo had pushed too hard, his invasive questioning about Gabriel and the night of the murder triggering a visceral, survivalist response in Alicia. In a sudden, blurred motion that Theo didn't see coming, she was across the room. Her hands locked around Theo's throat with a strength born of years of repressed trauma and fear. As he struggled for air, his vision tunneling, he looked into her lucid, predatory eyes. He didn't see a madwoman, he saw a mirror of his own desperation. He realized that her silence wasn't a symptom of madness, but a fortress she had built to protect herself from the intruders of her past. She wasn't attacking a doctor, she was attacking a ghost. He managed to pry her fingers loose just as the door burst open. Yuri, fearing for what had happened during his absence, dragged her away. Theo stood there in the center of the room, gasping for air, the red marks on his neck a physical testament to the psychic murder Alicia had endured and the violence she was capable of returning. He looked at the observation glass, knowing that the incident would be used to bury her further in sedation, but Theo felt a dark, pulsing sense of triumph. He had provoked her. The silence had been broken by violence, and now he knew that to make her speak, he would have to become the very thing she feared most. The bruises on Theo's neck served as a grim invitation into the deeper layers of Alicia's history, while the rest of the Grove staff saw the attack as proof of her incurable volatility. Theo viewed it as a breakthrough of the most profound kind. Seeking to understand the origin of what the institution labeled as her persecutory delusions, he requested a formal meeting with Dr. Christian West. The encounter took place in West's office, a room that smelled of takeaway food and professional self-satisfaction. With a large desk that seemed designed to keep visitors at a respectful distance. West treated Theo with a refined, cutting arrogance, making it clear through every gesture that he viewed Theo as a mere suburban Surrey boy who had overstepped his professional boundaries. West took a perverse pleasure in reminding Theo that he was out of his depth, dismissing Theo's theories as the romanticized, amateurish delusions of someone who didn't understand a woman like Alicia. During the meeting, West detailed the incident of the blind man, an elderly neighbor from the street where the Berensons lived. He explained that months before the murder, Alicia had become obsessed with the idea that this man was stalking her, watching her studio from the sidewalk for hours on end, even during the dead of night. West used this as his primary clinical evidence for Alicia's history of paranoia, framing her fear as a long-standing psychological defect rather than a reaction to a real threat. He mocked her artistic nerves, suggesting that her sensitivity was simply a precursor to her eventual psychotic break. Theo listened, but the internal voice of Ruth remained sharp and skeptical in his mind, suggesting that West's diagnosis was a convenient way to silence a woman whose reality was too inconvenient for the men in her life to investigate. The pressure of the dual life was beginning to take a physical toll on Theo. A constant, low-grade tension that vibrated in his muscles. By day, he was the clinical observer at the Grove, navigating the professional dynamics of the ward. Rowena Hart remained dismissive and unimpressed, viewing Alicia's refusal to engage as a personal slight she couldn't move past. By night, however, Theo was the observer in the shadows, tracking Kathy through the city. He began to see his own life as a series of repetitions, a hall of mirrors where he was always watching and being watched. He thought back to Daniel, the man Kathy had been dating when Theo first lured her away. He realized that he had been the first stalker in Kathy's life. The one who had facilitated the original betrayal of her previous relationship, and now the wheel was turning back toward him. The investigative fury that drove him began to bleed into his clinical work, making him more reckless and more effective. To manage the boiling resentment and the growing paranoia that his marriage was a hollow shell. Theo's nightly use of marijuana became his only anchor. In the heavy, sweet haze of the smoke, the distinction between his past and his present started to dissolve. He thought of Meredith, the sociology student from his university days, and the cold, fumbling failures of his early romantic life. He felt like a fraud in every room he entered. A man wearing a therapist's mask to hide the face of a predator who was increasingly unable to contain his own rage. The most disturbing piece of the puzzle emerged when Theo investigated Max Berenson, Gabriel's brother. When they met, Theo encountered a man whose charm was a thin, oily veneer over a core of cold intimidation. He realized that Alicia's reaction to Max wasn't just dislike, it was a profound, visceral revulsion. He discovered that Max had long harbored romantic feelings for Alicia. Feelings she had never welcomed, and that Gabriel had consistently ignored or minimized the discomfort this caused her, in order to maintain the family's polished image. Theo saw in Max a man who used his physical presence and force of personality to dominate the rooms he entered. Alicia's silence, Theo realized, was not just about the night Gabriel died. It was a response to a lifetime of being surrounded by men who treated her voice as a nuisance and her feelings as inconvenient. She was a woman who had been psychically undermined by the men in her life long before she ever reached the Grove. The heat followed Theo to Cambridge, a heavy, airless weight that seemed to trap the secrets of the past in the golden stone of the university town. He was there to find Vernon Rose, Alicia's father. The man who had authored the original silence of her life. The Rose family home was a decaying Victorian villa, its red brick strangled by overgrown ivy and its windows reflecting the flat, grey light of the fens. It was a house that stood as a monument to emotional neglect, a place where the air felt thick with the dust of old grievances. Inside, Theo met Paul Rose, Alicia's cousin, a man whose nervous energy and twitchy movements suggested a lifetime spent in the shadow of a much more dominant, more terrifying figure. As they moved through the dark, wood-paneled rooms and eventually up to the roof of the house, Theo felt the oppressive weight of the history buried here, a history of a family that had survived by ignoring its own rot. The conversation eventually led them to the roof, the very spot where the trajectory of Alicia's life had been forever altered. The wind whipped across the open space, but it offered no relief. Paul recounted the night of the car crash that had killed Alicia's mother. But it was the aftermath, the psychological wreckage, that held the true horror. He described a grief-stricken, drunken Vernon standing below in the garden, yelling for Alicia, consumed by his loss. He was so mad, Paul said. And then he said it, why didn't Alicia die instead? In that moment, Theo realized that the car crash hadn't been the only tragedy. Alicia hadn't merely lost her mother, she had lost her right to exist in her father's eyes. She didn't leave her body in a supernatural sense. But she became a ghost, unseen, unheard, and emotionally dead within her own home. This was the true origin of her silence, a survival mechanism born from the realization that she was an expendable substitute for the woman her father truly loved. This revelation provided the missing context for the Alcestis myth. Theo understood now that Alicia's silence was a literal interpretation of the Greek tragedy. Like Alcestis, she had died for the man who was supposed to protect her, but her death was a psychological erasure that left her wandering the halls of her own life as a phantom. The internal voice of Ruth echoed in Theo's mind, pointing out the cruel irony that he was now attempting to save a woman whose father had wished her dead years before. He saw the parallels between Vernon Rose and his own father. Men who used their words like weapons to dismantle the souls of their children, leaving behind hollowed-out adults who could only communicate through their own destruction. Before leaving for London, Theo also made time to visit Jean-Felix Martin, Alicia's gallerist, at his small Soho gallery. Jean-Felix had known Alicia for years, and spoke about her with a candor that the other people in her life had withheld. He offered Theo a more human portrait of Alicia than the clinical files ever could, a woman who was stressed about her work in the weeks before the murder, but who had seemed, to him, essentially herself. The visit left Theo with more questions than answers, but Jean-Felix's perspective added texture and warmth to the picture Theo was assembling. It also confirmed that Alicia's world before the murder was populated by people who cared for her, which made her destruction feel all the more brutal. Returning to London, the dual timeline of Theo's existence reached a boiling point. The domestic illusion of his marriage to Kathy was entirely gone, replaced by the mechanical, cold routine of his surveillance. He followed her again, watching from the darkness as the alibi of Nicole's return from New York failed to hold up under his watchful eye. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, it was a forensic reality that mirrored the infidelity he had committed against Marianne to be with Kathy. To manage the boiling resentment and the growing paranoia that he was becoming the very monster he had fled in Surrey, Theo's nightly marijuana use became a ritual of containment. The smoke was the only thing that kept the suburban Surrey boy from screaming at the injustice of a world that refused to give him the love he felt he was owed. At the Grove, the environment grew increasingly hostile. The incident in the therapy room had been used to argue for further restrictions on Alicia, and the Goldfish Bowl was alive with whispers of her impending transfer to a higher security facility where she would be buried forever. Theo knew his window was closing. He secured a final long window of time with Alicia and brought her the one thing that could bridge the gap between their silences, the truth. He spoke to her about the blind man and the stalker, watching for the moment when the artistic nerves West had mocked would reveal themselves as a legitimate, grounded fear. He saw a flicker of terrifying clarity in her eyes, a confirmation that the man in the garden was not a hallucination. Theo realized that Alicia had been hunted long before she ever reached the hospital, stalked by the shadow of a man who was now standing right in front of her. The final pages of the diary revealed a reality that Theo had meticulously tried to compartmentalize. The man in the garden, the figure Alicia had feared and West had dismissed as a symptom of artistic nerves, was not a hallucination or a phantom of her mind. He was a man driven by the same jagged, searing sense of betrayal that now defined Theo's every waking hour. As Theo read the entries, the timeline deception he had constructed for himself collapsed entirely. He wasn't just the therapist trying to fix a broken woman. He was the primary architect of her ruin. He had discovered Gabriel Berenson's affair with Kathy and had spent weeks stalking them, fueled by a nightly intake of marijuana that turned his grief into a cold, focused paranoia. He had become the very shadow Alicia had seen through her studio window, the silent watcher who had turned her sanctuary into a place of terror. On the night of the murder, Theo arrived at the house with a singular, lethal purpose. He had a gun in his pocket and he intended to kill Gabriel and then kill himself. He pulled a black balaclava over his head and put on black woolen gloves, moving with a cold, calculated precision. He broke into the house and found Alicia alone, waiting for Gabriel to come home. He tied her to a chair using the wire she kept for hanging canvases, binding her wrists and ankles. When Gabriel finally arrived and the lights fused and everything went dark, Theo knocked him unconscious in the hallway and dragged him into the living room, tying him to a second chair, back to back with Alicia, so she couldn't see his face. He wanted Gabriel to face the same psychic murder that Alicia's father had once inflicted upon her. He presented Gabriel with a choice. He gave him a single 10-second countdown, either Alicia dies, or Gabriel does. Gabriel had one chance to prove his love. As the seconds ran out, Gabriel's response was not a declaration of sacrifice but a broken, terrified whisper, "I don't want to die." He chose himself. He chose himself in that one, final, irreversible moment. Proving to Alicia that her adoration had been a lie and that, once again, she was expendable in the eyes of the man she loved. Theo fired a single shot into the ceiling and untied Alicia's wrists. Then he kissed her gently on the cheek, dropped the gun to the floor, and walked out, leaving the couple in the wreckage of their marriage. He believed he had delivered a psychological lesson, but he had underestimated the vacuum left behind when a person is murdered twice by the same man. Alicia, left alone with a husband who had just traded her life for his own, finally found her statement. She untied her ankles, picked up the gun, and shot Gabriel 5 times in the face. The silence that followed was not a shock. It was the only logical conclusion to a life where everyone who was supposed to love her had wished for her death instead. She had finally become the ghost her father said she was. Back in the present, at the Grove, the realization of who Theo was finally hit Alicia with the force of a physical blow. When she had choked him in the therapy room, it wasn't a random act of violence, it was a recognition. She saw the eyes of the man who had stood in her drawing room on that sweltering night. Theo realized his position was becoming untenable. Despite his careful navigation of the ward's dynamics, the truth was beginning to leak through the cracks of his composure. He could hear the internal voice of Ruth screaming at him to stop, to run, but the suburban Surrey boy within him was too deep into the game to quit. He was addicted to the power of being the only one who knew the secret. He knew he had to silence her permanently. During the quiet, dead hours of the night, Theo slipped into the seclusion wing. He approached Alicia with a syringe of morphine, his movements clinical and cold. He told himself it was a mercy, an Alcesta sacrifice that would end her suffering. But in reality, it was the final act of a man who had become a mirror of every predator he had ever studied. As the needle slid home, Alicia didn't fight. She didn't try to speak, and she didn't struggle. Instead, she looked at him with a terrifying clarity. She was calm, her silence finally becoming a weapon that he could never truly disarm. She knew that the truth was already waiting for him behind the canvas of her latest work, written specifically to him as a lethal letter from the woman he thought he had erased. The aftermath of Alicia's overdose brought a chilling shift to the Grove. While the administration scrambled to manage the medical emergency, Theo executed his final move with the cold, rhythmic precision of a man who had long ago justified his crimes as a form of justice. He used the clinical evidence he had gathered during his investigation to frame Christian West, pointing to the doctor's unethical private sessions with Alicia, conducted before she was ever admitted to the Grove and never disclosed, as proof of a guilty, panicked conscience. As West was led away by the authorities, his voice cracking with indignation, Theo felt a surge of professional triumph. He had successfully buried the truth beneath a mountain of bureaucratic suspicion and redirected the blame onto the very system that had tried to dismiss him. The narrative then shifts away from the stifling, airless heat of the London hospital to a freezing winter evening in Surrey. Theo had moved back to his roots, living in a house that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. The domestic illusion was entirely gone. He was living with Kathy, the woman he had destroyed a marriage to keep, yet they were now total strangers sharing a hollow space. Kathy was a shell of the vibrant woman he had stalked. She was a ghost drifting through the rooms, her days spent in a state of withdrawn depression, drowning out the reality of their existence with the constant, mind-numbing hum of the television. They lived in an ironic, heavy silence. Two people trapped by a secret that only one of them truly understood, while the other simply withered in the cold. The end began not with a dramatic chase, but with a quiet, persistent knock at the door. Chief Inspector Allen arrived on a night when the air was so sharp it felt like glass. The kitchen, despite the freezing temperatures outside, was sweltering. Kathy kept the central heating turned up so high it felt like a tropical greenhouse, a desperate, physical attempt to thaw a chill that was internal rather than environmental. Theo invited the inspector in for tea, the conversation moving with a deceptive, slow-paced geniality that Theo found almost comforting. He was a master of the mask, and he believed he could navigate this final interview with the same clinical detachment he had used at the Grove. It was then that Allen revealed the diary. Theo felt a momentary, electric spike of adrenaline. His mind racing through his memories of the hospital rooms to see if he had missed a page or a hidden entry. He had been so sure of his own cleverness, so certain that his arrogance had protected him from the silent woman. But Alicia had set a trap that played perfectly on that very ego. The diary had been hidden behind the painting he hated. Wedged tightly in the top left corner of the frame, discovered by Jean Felix Martin when he came to collect her art materials for a retrospective of her work. It was the one place Theo had never thought to look. He had walked past the evidence of his own crimes every day, blinded by his own contempt for what hung on that wall. As the inspector began to read Alicia's final, targeted entry aloud, the sweltering kitchen became a courtroom. The words were a damning, forensic revelation, detailing not only the night of Gabriel's murder and Theo's single, devastating countdown, but the cold, methodical attempt Theo had made to murder Alicia in the seclusion wing with the morphine. Hearing his own actions described in Alicia's unwavering written voice broke the final seal on Theo's carefully constructed reality. The internal voice of Ruth fell silent. There was no more containment, no more smoke to hide behind, and no more professional mask to wear. Theo felt a profound, heavy sense of relief. The pretending was over. He walked to the window and opened it, letting the freezing night air rush in to kill the artificial, suffocating heat of the kitchen. He extended his hand into the darkness and caught a single snowflake, watching it land and melt on his palm. The cold touch was a bridge to his past, a return to the memory of the only time he had felt free from the terror of his father's rages. For the first time in his adult life, he felt a strange, absolute calm. And he went to catch another one.